What can you tell me about supervised learning? There are at least 8 things that make supervised learning from unsupervised. They are data, feedback, what it does, what it knows, its goal, the types of problems that it solves, its accuracy, and is it AI? The type of data is labeled data. The type of feedback is direct. Is it predicting correctly? Yes or no? What it does, it predicts output. What it knows both input and output. What's its goal? To train the model so it can predict accurately on new data. What types of problems does it solve? Classification and regression. How accurate is it? It's more accurate than unsupervised. Is it AI? It's not really AI because it needs to be trained to be able to predict. So, what were the 8 ways that you could describe supervised learning? Data, feedback, what it does, what it knows, its goal, the types of problems it solves, its accuracy, and is it AI? What are the 2 types of supervised learning algorithms? Classification and regression. Can you give me an example of each? Classification is hot dog, not hot dog. It either is something or it isn't something. Regression is, should I wear shorts tomorrow? If I predict the weather, I should be able to know the temperature. What type of data does each use? Classical uses categorical. Regression uses numerical. What's the difference between the 2 histograms that we would see, or charts that we would see, or graphs that we would see? Well, they both have the dependent variable on the y-axis typically, and the independent variable on the x-axis. The regression would have something that looks like an S as the decision boundary in the middle, and it can output ranges that only fall between 0 and 1 as its output because it either is or isn't something, versus linear regressions have more of an rise over run linear separation or decision boundary that can exceed beyond the 0 and the 1 because it is predicting a numeric output. So how does classification work versus regression? Classification learns by training on the training set, and then it applies that training to new data. By categorizing data into classes is how you know the output. With regression, it finds correlations between dependent and independent variables, and it helps with predicting continuous variables. Can you describe the difference between classification and regression algorithms in terms of output types or the data that it outputs? Classification outputs discrete data. Regression outputs continuous data. What kind of task do they each perform? Classification maps input X to discrete output Y, and regression maps input X to continuous output Y. How do they make decisions? Classification has a decision boundary to divide things into classes, and regression uses a best fit line to predict the output more accurately. What are some further algorithms for each? Classification has binary and multiclass, and regression has linear and non-linear regression. What are other ways to distinguish between classification and regression? We can talk about what it predicts, its results, its types, and examples. Predicts, results, types, and examples. What classification predicts is a class. What regression predicts is a value. Results. For classification, what is the result? The input is labeled, the data is labeled as belonging to a specific class. In regression, data predicts a quantity or value. What types for each? Classification, it's based on the number of classes and it can be binary or multiclass. And for regression, it could be multiple input variables, which are called multivariate regression. So for classification, you can only have a discrete number of classes. And in regression, you can have more than one input at a time. What are some examples? For classification, you could use it for spam or not spam. And for regression, you could use it for what temperature will it be tomorrow? Can you tell me about logistic and linear regression? Both logistic and linear regression are supervised learning algorithms. What does each predict? Logistic regression, the classification algorithm, predicts a class, and linear regression predicts a value. What would a visualization of these look like? What would be on each of the axes? We would have the dependent variables on the y-axis and the independent variables on the x-axis is one way to visualize. And what is the decision boundary like for each? The decision boundary for a regression algorithm is an S-curve, and the predicted y lies within the 0 and 1 range, versus the linear regression is a typically slanted straight line, and the predicted y can exceed the 0 or the 1 on the dependent variable axis. What does each one output? Logistic regression will give you a number that is either close to 0 or close to 1 typically, because it's trying to predict a class, versus a linear regression will give you a value because it is computing the rise over the run.